Zuck Buck's election integrity, and Hans von Spakovsky on this week's episode of Fresh Freedom. Welcome back to the Fresh Freedom Podcast. As you know, this is the podcast with the freedom-loving freshman members of the House of Representatives, where we provide you a behind-the-scenes look at what's happening in Congress. I'm joined by my fellow conservative freshman members of Congress, Josh Burkeen from Oklahoma and Keith Self from Texas. And our special guest today is Hans von Spakovsky from Heritage Foundation.
Wow.
Hans is a manager of Heritage's Election Law Reform Initiative and the Senior Legal Fellow for the Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Under President Trump, Hans was appointed to the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity in 2017. Before joining Heritage Foundation, Hans served on the Federal Election Commission, as well as the Justice Department, and so much more. Welcome, Hans.
Thanks for having me.
He got your last name correct?
Yeah, you did. In fact, I have to tell you, you did a better job than some of the Fox hosts I have to do.
Great.
Who are always mispronouncing my last name.
You did great.
So you do have a unique name, and I think you were telling us about a little bit of your heritage.
Right.
You're you're an immigrant, or your family.
I'm first generation.
First generation.
And it's my parents' experiences that really made me interested in making sure we have fair and honest elections. Because my mother's German. She grew up in Nazi Germany. My father was a white Russian, escaped communism. They immigrated here in 1951. And frankly, my childhood was filled with stories from them about what it was like living under tyranny and a dictatorship. And
wow.
Boy, the most important guarantee against that, as you know, is our ability to vote in honest elections.
So your mother escaped Nazi Germany. Now she would have left after the war was over with.
After the war was over.
So she experienced all of the destruction.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And my father got out of Russia, escaped communism, moved to Yugoslavia, and then in 1946, when Tito and the communists took over there, he had to flee again.
And then how did they find each other?
How'd they fall in love? You got Russia versus Germany. I mean, how did all that?
Well, my father had to flee Yugoslavia. He figured, quite correctly, the safest place in Europe would be where there were American troops. So he headed for the American occupied sector of Germany, and he met my mother in a refugee camp there.
That's wonderful. That's an amazing story. And then they decided to
immigrate to the U.S. Well, I'll tell you, I don't know, a lot of people don't remember this, but we had a lot of troops in Europe after the end of World War II, and people were really pushing to bring them all home. Mm-hmm. And the Russians were advancing communism, all the Eastern Bloc and everything. My father was afraid the Americans would leave, and the Russians would take over the rest of Europe, and he didn't want to be there if that happened. And that's one of the reasons they immigrated.
Huh. So where did you grow up? Where did you?
I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama.
Oh, wonderful.
So my last name, a typical Alabama name.
Yeah, of course. Well, last episode we had Andrew Clyde, and he has 2 Doberman Pinschers. What are you, a dog guy or a cat guy?
Dog guy, not cats.
Any particular breed?
I like everything, although I grew up with a great friend of mine had one of those a Lassie type collie who had I think had been trained to be a sheepdog, and he was just a terrific dog.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's jump into the deep stuff, the election stuff. Right. So you've kind of become an expert nationally on how to have safe and secure elections. Right. Tell us how you got into that whole. How did you grow up as a kid saying, "I want to be an expert"? Like this, when I grow up, I want to do this.
I was a lawyer working in Atlanta. This was a long time ago. And I got involved with the local Republican Party. And one day, the chairman of the party came and said, there's a county commission race coming up, and we need poll watchers. And he kind of twisted my arm, and I ended up a poll watcher, and I ended up in one of the worst precincts you can imagine in Atlanta. And, most poll watchers, I think, have a pretty boring day. Not a lot happens. But when I got there, I discovered this was a overwhelmingly Democratic precinct. But there were a small number of Republicans there. This was a general election, and when people were coming in and giving their name in order to be able to vote, the people behind the desk were saying, well, are you a Republican or a Democrat? And they clearly were trying to discourage Republicans from asking for a ballot and voting. I couldn't believe this was going on. So I walked out of the polling place and got out my cell phone and called the county election department, complained about it, and they actually sent somebody down there and told the folks to stop it. But that really made me realize,
Can you explain that? When you say, what would they're asking them what their party affiliation was. If they had answered Republican, what were they doing differently than the
Well, I think they were trying to intimidate them, because this is an overwhelmingly Democratic precinct, and if you say you're a Republican, they're looking at you, and everybody else is looking at you, going, "What are you doing here voting?" So to me, it was and that's an improper question. You can't ask that in a general election.
Yeah.
So that really made me realize that making sure we have good elections and we have all the kind of laws to protect people, we need them. And at the time, Georgia didn't really require an ID to vote. So I ended up writing a white paper for the Georgia Public Policy Foundation saying, you know what, Georgia, after what I've seen, Georgia really needs to require an ID to vote.
So you kind of started in the middle of the hanging Chad kind of era, right?
Yes, that's exactly right.
And
so this was 2000 era? 2000 time frame?
Yeah, no, in fact, I was an observer down in Florida twice for that.
So tell us about that. That must have been a wild experience.
Yeah, it was. Well, it was it made me realize that hand counting is not a good idea, because I was an observer, and it's very difficult for people to, even when they're trying to do the best, to count one ballot after another, observing them for hours, you start making mistakes. And it went pretty smoothly, except for one of the other observers who wanted to argue over all these different ballots and whether they should be counted or not. And but it was an interesting experience. Like the entire media world was down there too.
So we've now transitioned to, it's not the hanging Chad. We're wondering about people that are here illegally that may have a chance to vote. You've been
wow, that was a big jump.
Talking
Because
about
we went from the hanging Chad to election interference, right? And the Democrats said that they got involved in the election process, and then today our big fight is immigration. You're right.
Yeah. Well, it should be, because today it is the biggest problem we've ever had. The numbers of aliens coming into the country illegally, we've never seen numbers like this.
So
and
10 million in 3 years.
In 3 years, right?
What do you think the number is? I've seen FAIR, they think that there's 20 million here, sum total, illegally right now.
I think that's probably right. Some years ago, DHS put out an official estimate of between 10 and 12 million, but a lot of private groups and other studies said it was probably twice that much.
So if there's 20 million out of 334 million Americans, somebody can do some quick math for me, because only math is not going to get me there without a calculator. Olney's the town I grew up in.
It's probably,
anybody have what percentage
it's a little,
is that?
I mean, it's probably 9% of the population.
So that's sizable.
Yeah, it is. And could it make a difference? First of all, the left claims, well, aliens aren't registering and voting, but in fact, that's not true.
Talk us through that. Tucker Carlson did a show last week. Now, my staff has given me some information. I did an interview this morning on the radio where it's not just the element of, did you think you were an alien of legal, or did you think you were here with citizenship status? You also have to be the parent, you have to be the child, and you have to have had permanent residency by the time you turn 16, plus that other element. So my understanding is what Tucker was talking about is a threefold characteristic to where that person could actually, that title of law would apply. Expound upon what your concerns are about, and let people know what should we really be concerned about with them.
Well, the biggest problem right now is that states aren't requiring proof of citizenship when you register to vote.
Okay.
So it's an honor system. Yeah, there's a question on the form where you say whether or not you're a citizen, and they're supposedly supposed to not register you if you say you're not a citizen, although I've seen actual voter registration forms where even when the person said I'm not a citizen, they still got registered. The issue is that, look, in every state, if you're an alien and you're here legally, you can get a driver's license. And DMVs, unfortunately, many of them are very sloppy about this. And even when somebody is an alien and they come in and present papers saying they're an alien, they still get registered to vote. And anybody who thinks it doesn't happen, I will tell you, I know it happens because some years ago, I was actually on a county election board in Virginia. And I said to our registrar, look, do you guys ever run our voter registration list against the DMV list? They said, well, no, we've never done that. I said, do it. So they did it, and they found almost 300 individuals who we had registered to vote in our county who were not U.S. citizens. They'd said that when they went to DMV.
Just in one county.
In one county. And about half of them had already voted in past elections. And we investigated, we confirmed they weren't U.S. citizens, yet they were registered to vote. We took them off the list, and then we did two things.
So I'm missing this. So you're saying that
about almost 300 aliens are here legally, but they had all registered to vote. About half of them had voted in a Virginia election, and we took them off the list. Well, registering and voting is a felony under federal law. It's also a violation of Virginia law. So we sent the files on these people, easy cases.
To the FBI.
Well, we sent them to the
Justice
U.S.
Department
Department of Justice.
Yeah.
This is during the Obama administration. And we sent them to the local DA, and neither the U.S. Justice Department nor the local DA did a thing about it.
And yet they will claim all day long, and every year they will claim that there is no voter fraud occurring on any kind of scale.
Right. So that's a problem, and a number of states, have now switched to automatic voter registration. So if you go into DMV, they don't say to you, would you like to register? They automatically register you. California is one of the states that does that. And as you know, California is one of the states that also provides driver's licenses to aliens who are here illegally.
Yeah.
And what California says is, well, it's up to the voter, it's up to the person once they get registered to then call us and tell us, oh, I shouldn't be registered. It's a problem. But plus the other thing is, and you all know this because you're members of the House, there's this terrible problem of representation being distorted in the U.S. House of Representatives, and the votes of U.S. citizens being diluted because when they do apportionment, it's based on total, after the census, it's based on total population. So that means that states with large populations of aliens, particularly those who are here illegally,
sanctuary cities that attract them.
Yeah, they're getting more members of Congress than they should, and what does that do? It dilutes the votes of U.S. citizens. Plus, it distorts the political representation of the states.
Well, then Hans, why did every Democrat vote against the citizenship question on the census? Because aren't the blue cities and the blue states going to benefit from that?
They want aliens to be able to register and vote. You can see the camel's nose under the tent because, as you know, San Francisco, New York,
Washington,
District
D.C.
of Columbia have all made it legal for aliens to vote in local elections, and they've done it to the point where
You said local there.
Local.
Now, explain that to me. I've had a member of Congress tell me from New York that they feel pretty confident that they think that in federal elections, illegals are having the opportunity to cast a ballot. How is that? How are they able to cast on local and not federal?
Well, because it's a violation of federal law for an alien to vote.
But I mean, there's lots of things. But
there's lots of things in place that look. If an alien registers, how is a state going to know they're not a U.S. citizen when they're not requiring proof of citizenship.
That's what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
when I'm
But
just saying,
legally, it's against the law for aliens to vote in federal elections. But those cities have made it legal for them to vote in local elections.
Or is it that they're not punishing, or they've made it clear that they won't punish?
They won't
them?
punish, right?
So it's kind of the anti-commandeering doctrine, where they're not going to enforce federal law.
so I mean, with what you described a while ago, in a county with 300 people that were not legal had been voting, there was no consequence either from the local DA or the Department of Justice.
Right.
So just want to make sure I'm clear. Just because may not be legal doesn't mean that we don't have in federal elections illegals county by county voting.
Yeah, and it's not just illegals, but it's also aliens who are here illegally. So it's both aliens who are here, have permission to be
Illegally
here,
and
and aliens who are here illegally. I mean, look, the House Administration Committee, which is going to have a hearing soon about this, remember in '96 they issued a report, they investigated a congressional race in San Diego. And that race was decided by less than 1,000 votes. And when they started checking INS records, they concluded, if I remember the numbers correctly, that about 700 of the less than 1,000 votes, I think it was 900 something, had been cast by aliens who were improperly registered and improperly voted. They didn't overturn the election, but that was because it was a small margin, and that's 30 years ago. 30 years ago, there were already enough aliens registering and voting in California to have almost overturned a congressional race.
So we had a hearing last week in Budget Committee where a FAIR representative talked about how right now if you come from Cuba or Haiti, I believe are the two nations, that under the parole process, the CBP-1 app, they automatically are getting Social Security numbers.
Right.
Automatically. It's an automatic under parole from those two countries. And they're given legal status. Therefore, I can tell you in Illinois, because I looked it up with a staffer, my legislative director now, and I looked it up, on Illinois' website, for you to be able to register to get a real ID, you have to show, part of that is that you have legal work status. Mm-hmm. Well, parole is legal work status.
Right.
So they can check the box on the Illinois website, get a real ID compliant driver's license in the state of Illinois. And so once they're here, they've got a Social Security number, they've got driver's license. Right. I mean, they're voting. I mean, unless
it's easy for them to register and vote, and even though it's against the law, and if they got caught, the chances are very high that neither a local DA nor the Justice Department will do anything about it.
So what are you hearing about right now? We're hearing that under this administration, they're sending out, in addition to what the state does to help you get registered to vote,
right.
But there are federal, Medicaid, I don't know if it's TANF, I don't know if it's SNAP, but we're getting information that this administration is sending out information to encourage people how to get access to vote. Are you hearing?
What happened was, as you all know, in the 2020 election, the left came up with a very clever idea. As you know, they came up with what everybody's calling Zuck bucks, right? Mark Zuckerberg and some other liberals gave $450 million to a small left-wing nonprofit, and that nonprofit then gave grants to election officials all over the country, but the money overwhelmingly was going to Democratic urban districts, which is the heart of the Democratic vote. And what was the point of that? It was to take the Get Out the Vote campaign that normally the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates have to pay with, as you know, hard dollars. Dollars have to be reported. It was to move that into government offices with nonprofit money. And let me tell you, it made a difference in the election. If you look at the turnout numbers, turnout in those areas went up dramatically. A lot of states got smart and started banning this. Missouri is one of them, I know, that banned it. I think about 28 states banned it. So as soon as the Biden administration came in, they said, well, we need a new version of this because states are banning it. So Joe Biden signed an executive order telling every executive agency, you have to become voter registration agencies. You have to make sure that all the people that come to you that you're dealing with, the members of the public, whether it's somebody applying for disability benefits, even the U.S. Marshal Service, with prisoners, you have to get them registered to vote. You have to help them with absentee ballots. Oh, and by the way, we want you contracting with and bringing in NGOs, nonprofit groups, to help you do this on government premises. And of course, They only bring in left-wing groups. And all of this is a violation of federal law.
I know in Missouri we had some pushback because we tried to ban Zuckerbucks.
Right.
It was stripped out of a committee hearing by a Republican. Stripped it out on behalf of the county clerks, and they're requesting because they liked getting the money. They wanted to get the free money. For them, it was like manna from heaven, right?
Right.
But then, but to your point, it greased the wheels on one side of the car, and if you grease it enough, you'll see a drift. And I said, when it came to the Senate floor, our election integrity bill, I added two things. I added Zuckerbucks. I banned Zuckerbucks, and then I also required our county election authorities from the county level all the way to the Secretary of State to have a cybersecurity audit before every election.
Oh, that's a great idea. That's what ought to be happening in every state.
Well, Hans, we've got gloom and doom at the federal level. I represent a very red district in Texas.
Right.
My constituents are interested in election integrity.
Right.
What do I tell them at the
man.
local level? Because this is all basically federal, state
Well,
level.
I'll tell you, look, the one good thing that came out of the 2020 election is it made a lot of, like I've been working on this issue a long time. The 2020 election finally made a lot of state legislators, particularly in red states, realize, we got vulnerabilities in the system. We need to finally fix them. So Texas, for example, as you know, they passed a terrific reform bill. Georgia.
Was it better than Missouri's?
It was.
No, well, you guys were just a little bit late on the game. Georgia passed a terrific reform bill too.
Is theirs requiring photo ID now for absentee ballots? Is that what they're doing?
Yes, that was
in
just
Georgia?
one of the many
Georgia.
things. Both Georgia and Texas. Look, Texas and Georgia already had voter ID laws in place, but they only applied to in-person voting. And as you know, in the 2020 election, folks on the left really pushed to increase mail-in balloting, which is the most insecure way you can vote. And so what Texas did, very smart.
Minnesota Supreme Court struck down their ballot harvesting, right? Their mail-in, their drop boxes. Is that Minnesota?
It was Wisconsin.
Wisconsin. I'm sorry. I'm glad you said that. Wisconsin.
But look, both those states passed big reform packages, very good packages to improve the integrity of the election process. Look, they're good because what did Joe Biden do? He went all the way to Atlanta to give a big speech comparing Georgia's reform bill to Jim Crow 2.0. Of course, they then had an election.
He would know because
right.
because he supported the version 1.
Right.
And this is the guy who did the, was it Robert Byrd, KKK member?
Right.
Yeah.
And he
Supported
spoke.
Byrd.
He spoke at Robert Byrd's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So most of the red states have really improved the security of their election process. I mean, it's not just Texas and Georgia, but many other states have
I think 14.
made changes.
Don't they say 14 states have improved?
have really made things better. So we're actually in better shape for the 24 election. Now,
Wisconsin,
But
Georgia.
in the key states.
Yeah, what are the swing
Yes.
states?
How about the big five?
Yeah.
The five we talk about.
yeah. Now, in Pennsylvania, when the Republicans controlled the state legislature, they kept passing reform packages the governor kept vetoing. The one bill they were able to get through that the governor signed was a ban on Zuckbucks. And just recently, there was a terrific case in the federal courts there because folks on the left had sued saying, the law in Pennsylvania that says that when a voter fills out his absentee ballot, he's got to both sign it and date it.
Yeah.
They said, it doesn't matter if he doesn't date it. You should count it anyway. And the courts have said, no, that's an enforceable statute. Of course that's important.
But
So there have been good developments in many of the states. Places like New York and California, of course,
Arizona.
yeah, they haven't really improved things. In fact, we a couple of years ago started a thing we call our election integrity scorecard. We actually spent a year analyzing the laws of every single state and comparing them to a set of best practices that we came up with.
this is Heritage.
This is at Heritage. So things like, does the state have an ID law? Does it also cover absentee ballots? And of the 50,
How many states do we have right now that do not require photo
Wait,
identification?
probably about a third. And two of the worst states are New York and California, two of the biggest states in the country. You don't need an ID to vote.
Keep going. I interrupted you.
Anyway, so we score the states. Best score is 100, worst is 0, and it probably doesn't surprise you that the worst states in the country, at the bottom of our rankings, are New York, California, Nevada, Hawaii,
Illinois.
places like that. Illinois hasn't done very well either.
And at the top,
The top are
Who's your
it's
number
all
one
red states.
what's the number one state?
He's wanting you to say Missouri. That's what he's fishing for here.
Well, Missouri is. I don't
shows.
remember the number. On Missouri's way up in the top
Probably.
too.
We
It's not
we
number
moved
one.
way up
You're right behind
after my
Oklahoma.
bill.
Eric. You're
Right now, I
behind
think
Oklahoma.
Tennessee is number one. Florida, Georgia, but they're all really, really close.
You're probably in the top 20.
Yeah, you are. No, you're higher than that. Well, that bill, you guys passed a really good bill recently, and I think Missouri had the biggest jump up in our rankings because of all the improvements.
So people often ask us at different events, what are you guys doing on the federal level? And I want to get you to kind of weigh in. Article 1, Section 4 talks about time, place, and manners left to the state legislature. That it gives the federal government the authority to have limited over House and Senate opportunities to have influence, not just influence, but constitutional authority. Why should, I'm going to start with the two-part question. Why should we make sure that is very narrow? And I will set you up with my own thought. When's the last time the federal government took anything away from the states and not in alignment with the Constitution? It worked out very well. So how would you answer that first question?
I think the feds, Congress should pretty much stay out of this. States have been running our elections since our founding. And while there might be some states that are bad, if Congress completely takes it over, which Constitution I don't think they could do anyway, why then we might have bad rules in every single state. But let me tell you what I think Congress ought to do.
So let's talk about, can you transition to Chip Roy's idea and his bill?
What Congress needs to do is make sure that the federal government is assisting the states. And an example of that is that, we're talking about alien voting. Well, look, the Department of Homeland Security has a huge database. And in that database are aliens who are here legally and therefore applied for a visa, right? Aliens who are here illegally who were detained at some point. Now, what they don't have are the aliens, the gotaways, right? The ones who've never been detained.
2 million.
But election officials ought to have access to those DHS databases so they can check when people are registering to vote. Well, are they in the DHS database? Does DHS show that they're not a U.S. citizen? That's a minimal thing they ought to do. The other thing they ought to do is, right now there's a law in place, it's in the National Voter Registration Act, that says that when somebody's convicted of a felony in federal court, most people don't know about this, the U.S. attorney who got that conviction must send information about that conviction to state election officials. So if it's a state where you lose your right to vote, they can take them off the rolls. Well, people who are called for jury duty in federal courts, where do you think the federal courts get their lists of people to call for jury duty? They get them from state election officials. It's the voter registration list. And GAO did a study more than 10 years ago where they went to a couple of federal courts and said, well, how many of the people that you guys call for jury duty get excused because they're not a U.S. citizen? And in one of the courts, it was about 3% of everybody they called for jury duty. Well, those federal courts, they don't do anything with that information. They ought to be obligated under federal law to send that information back to election officials in that state and say, this person who's on your voter registration list, they swore under oath they were not a U.S. citizen, therefore you need this information, so they can take them off. I mean, that's just...
And prosecute them.
And prosecute them. Yeah, the information should also be sent to the Justice Department.
But aren't people just intimidated with the word disenfranchised?
Well, the people who are being disenfranchised are eligible U.S. citizens.
Absolutely, but they get painted with that. Anytime you try to take anybody off of the voter rolls or have any sort of enforcement mechanism, they scream you're disenfranchising eligible voters, whether they're eligible or not.
Yeah, I'll tell you though, the public doesn't believe that. and I'll give you an example of this. Look, for the last 10 years, the left has been running a propaganda campaign to say that requiring an ID is vote suppression.
Correct.
Keeps people from voting, right?
That's right.
The polling on this is actually remarkable. The polling shows that American people overwhelmingly support an ID. They think it's common sense. And listen, it doesn't matter whether they're Republicans or Democrats. It doesn't matter whether they're black or white, Asian or Hispanic. A majority of all voters say, yes, you should require an ID, which tells you that this propaganda campaign that the left has been running isn't working. The Americans are too smart, they have too much common sense to believe that.
But you don't have to convince the American public. They've got more common sense
Right.
than the people that are going to kowtow or going to cow to be cowed by that propaganda. And those are the people that they were influencing. The people that might have to stand up and say, yes, I'm going to take you off the road.
Well, you're right. That is a problem, but those people should take courage from the fact that if you, like I said, if you look at the polling, it shows that that claim just doesn't work. In fact, listen, the claim that, for example, black Americans can't get an ID, that is one of the most patronizingly racist things.
It is racist.
I can imagine. And it's been proven to be not true. In Georgia, for example, look, their voter ID law went in place in 2008. They've had election after election after election, and all the turnout data shows not only has it not suppressed the vote, they've had record turnout and record registration among all of their voters, including African American voters.
Because people know that their vote will count.
Yes, that is a very important point. Keeping the confidence of the public in elections is a key point in getting turnout in elections.
There's a Stalin or Lenin quote, and I can't remember which one of the two, Stalin or Lenin, communism, and it said, "He who casts the vote counts little. He who counts the vote counts for much." And so for what we talked about, I was asking a question a while ago about what constitutionally does the federal government have the authority to do. Right. We have the authority to provide regulatory oversight, and to Article 1, Section 4 gives us on federal elections some authority.
Right.
Chip Roy has a bill. Now there's also another element in the Constitution that in the 18 enumerated powers of Article 1, Section 8, it lists naturalization uniformity, which means granting citizenship status. Right. So with citizenship status, we have authority. Congress has that authority. And then we have the authority of what Article 1, Section 4 talks about. So Chip Roy's got a bill. Would you talk about that bill? Because
Sure.
many people know what can we do on the federal level that's constitutional that can actually help this problem?
Well, as you know, normally, while Congress's power extends to federal elections, normally Congress can't set up what the rules are for state and local elections. But Congress definitely has the power to say, and this is what Chip Roy's bill does, that when you register to vote, you have to provide proof of citizenship. And the reason is because of the power that Congress has, as you said, over aliens in this country, over naturalization. A great example of this is, as you all know, when you all run for the House, you've got to comply with the Federal Election Campaign Act, right? That's the federal law that governs raising money and spending money. Well, there's a provision in there that says that no foreign individuals, no foreign governments, no foreign entities can participate directly or indirectly in all U.S. elections, federal, state, and local. In other words, that rule doesn't just apply to federal elections, but also to state and local elections. And why is that? Because of the power Congress has over aliens. So that is well within the authority, and it's one that needs to happen.
So as we approach this coming election, that's critical in the trajectory of where we're going to go as a nation. What things are give you more confidence, and what concerns do you see on the horizon in this coming election?
Well, the fact that a lot of states, a number of states, have passed good improvements, everything from banning private funding, Zuck bucks, to places like Texas and Georgia extending their ID requirement to absentee ballots. That that makes me more confident of the outcome. I do think we need to be sure that people, as much as possible, participate in both being election officials wherever they live and being poll watchers. I started off as a poll observer a long time ago. That's how I got into elections. And boy, having observers in polling places is so important, because that's how you can try to make sure that the law is being followed, and that you know if something is happening that shouldn't have. The example I'd give you of this, I don't know if you guys remember this. Remember in 2008, there was a young college kid who was a poll watcher in Philadelphia. And he was standing outside a polling place when these members of the new Black Panther Party came up in paramilitary black outfits, one of them with a nightstick, and they started yelling racial epithets and hassling the white voters going into this polling place. And the only reason we know about it is because he was there as a poll watcher, and he actually got out his cell phone and took pictures of what they were doing. If it hadn't been for that, no one would have realized this was going on. That tells you the importance of poll watchers.
So how does someone who's watching this program participate? How do they reach out to their county election board secretary and say, what can I do to be...
Yeah, they ought to. County election officials are always desperate for people to work in the polls because they're always short. And I don't know what it is. It's the generations, but the average age of poll workers these days is well up into the 60s, early 70s, because not enough young people are getting into this. They should work in polling places, and if they don't have time to do that, be a poll watcher for a candidate or a political party so that you can be in the polls observing what's going on.
That's great advice. Well, Hans, thank you for joining us.
Sure.
Thank you for being a watchdog over our elections in such a critical time, and thank you for everything that you do for the cause. And to you, thank you to our amazing listeners. If you enjoyed the banter and the bold ideas, show us some love. Hit the like and subscribe button for your regular dose of freedom. Fresh Freedom Podcast is your ticket to liberty, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, X, and Rumble. Until next time, stay free. We'll catch you on the next episode of Fresh Freedom.